Hello, I'm Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona. Today we're inside the Central Methodist Church. This church is not only one of Winona's oldest churches, celebrating 150 years in 2005, but one of Winona's grandest churches. It also has some very interesting stories. Today we'll learn the history of this church, hear the stories, and take a tour of this magnificent building. This church on the corner of Broadway and Main took a significant change in the 1960s when they had a massive fire which changed the total outlook of the church as to the way we see it today. And here to tell us about it is the long-time church member, Al Thurley.
Thanks, Joyce.
Hi, Al. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, I know that you have been a member since birth.
Right.
Well, tell me about the church. Let's talk about the history of it, because I understand you really know the history.
Actually, the church itself started just shortly after Winona itself was founded, Winona being founded in 1851. And in about 1855, a circuit rider came from Wisconsin to begin what is today Central Methodist Church. And April 22nd of 1855, a group of people gathered in homes. And then in 1856 began construction of a frame building on Lafayette Street, kind of between Broadway and 5th Street, near where St. Paul's Episcopal Church is. And worship services and other meetings were held there till about 1872, when the congregation had grown to the point of building a larger and fancier church. It kind of paralleled and mirrored the success of Winona, because a lot of the folks who were involved in the church were active lumber barons and railroad people. We had a wonderful resource of people who believed in the church and helped it grow in those years.
Two names that stand out from that time are Artie Cohn, the hardware store owner, and lumberman Matthew Norton. They were both instrumental in the building of the new church on the lot next to the wooden frame church on Lafayette Street. This brick veneer building could accommodate over 200 members and was built for a cost of $20,000 and known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1874, the church opened another church in the west end of town, which they called the Olive Branch Mission. This building at 801 West Broadway had been a chapel used by the YMCA for union services. The original chapel was located at Sioux and Broadway, and in 1915 this brick building replaced the Olive Branch Mission and became its own entity known as the McKinley Methodist Church, still named so in honor of its former pastor. The Methodist Church on Lafayette Street was furnished well and contained the first pipe organ of southern Minnesota. Al tells us what happened to that organ, and ironically, what happened to that building.
And it was about 23 years later when somebody noticed smoke coming from that pipe organ, that the church itself, the building, was engulfed in fire, and Central Methodist had its first church fire. Prior to that fire, the church leaders had begun the process of acquiring lands on Broadway near Main Street to build an even larger structure. So plans were well underway when the fire struck, so that by 1897, the structure was built originally here at the corner of Broadway and Main. Part of the land was actually owned by Judge William Mitchell, of course, of the Mitchell College of Law in the Twin Cities.
And a fabulous church it was.
Yes.
Judge Mitchell's property on the corner of Main and Broadway was purchased for $15,000, and 2 years later, a magnificent building was constructed for a cost of $100,000. Again, Matthew Norton and his brother James underwrote much of the cost. Matthew also donated the pipe organ and the parsonage next to the church. An arched staircase stood at the entrance of the church between two towers. The smaller tower on the right held a steeple less than half the height of the grand steeple on the left, rising to well over 150 feet. To the left of this steeple was a drive-through designed for the coaches and horse and buggies of the day. Behind the steeple we can see a rounded turret with arched stained glass windows. In 1907, Matthew Norton, along with a legacy left by William Keith, purchased 11 bells weighing 11,000 pounds to be installed in the magnificent tower of the church. These bells are still played today. The bells are played from a room within the tower, which lies 3 stories below. It is reached from a spiral staircase which continues on up to the bells themselves. The room is square with wainscoting wrapped around it and a collection of 100 bells from all over the nation, placed lovingly there by its former occupant, John Duell. The console, which was updated in the 50s to accommodate 3 more bells, stands at the center. There are 2 stained glass windows which hold the image of a harp and a bell. They bring in colored light to brighten the room and inspire the bell player.
We're now currently standing in the bell tower of the Methodist Church, and I'm standing with Dick Harrington, who is the person who generally plays these bells.
Right.
Hi, Dick. Now, I understand that you have been a part of this church since 1926.
That's the year I was born, but I was baptized in this church that year.
And now you're back up here playing the bells. But you haven't always played these bells. There's been someone else in the
right.
past who was a big part of this. Let's talk about him for a moment.
Actually, there are many people going back a ways, and there's a long list, but mainly we should talk about John Duell, who was a music teacher in junior high school when the school was across the street, and came over here 7 days a week for just about 53 years. He passed away in 2000. He seldom missed a day. And when he couldn't play, why, we had several people who helped. And I was lucky enough to be one. After I graduated from Hamlin and came back here to work for Hal Leonard, the regular schedule is 5 o'clock every day for 15 minutes, Monday through Saturday, and then before church on Sunday.
Dick, let's talk a little bit more about John. Now, I've heard some really interesting stories about John Duell. For instance, after the fire, that same day of the fire, it occurred in the morning, and then at 5 o'clock, I understand that he actually came up in the tower, which was still smoldering, and actually somehow played the bells.
Maybe it's apocryphal, but whatever it is, it's a good story, and I think he really did it. Keith Schwab was here, and they were worried about the fact that they didn't know where the damage was to the tower. Had there been flames where the bells are suspended, the one bell weighs over a ton, and they were afraid they might fall. So they got up there with ladders and couldn't go all the way up here, but got through to it. And everything was frozen because the fire department had been spraying water. They couldn't play from the console because it was frozen solid. And I believe that John either had a hammer or something in his pocket and hit them a couple times just to say they sounded on that day. This is John at the keyboard, at the console, reading out of a large hymnal. And I want to tell people that if they ever hear Happy Birthday played in going by the church, it's only played once during the year. And it's on February 1st, which was John's birthday. And we've written out a nice, neat arrangement of it with a reminder that on the first day of every February, ring Happy Birthday in honor of John Duell. There are 11 bells that were installed in 1907, I believe the date was. And that limits somewhat what you can play, but we've managed to get through it for many years. And then when P. Earl Schwab passed away, part of his estate bought 3 more bells to extend the range and make it possible to play a lot more music. For instance, on the 11 bells, you couldn't play Silent Night with the right pitches and things because there were too many notes. After those 3 are installed, now you can.
Dick, can you explain to us exactly how this all works? I know now the bells are actually way up above us.
About 3 stories. Yeah.
How does this all work? How is this connected?
Well, these large oak levers pivot on the back, and when you push one down, it pulls. This is aircraft cable, as a matter of fact. This is a fairly recent improvement. That extends up those full 3 stories, and it goes over a pulley, and it is fastened to the clapper of the bell. The bell is here, the clapper hanging down, the wire comes over and connects. Then it runs past that clapper to a recoil spring. If you didn't have that spring and I played it, the clapper would stay against the side of the bell and it would just go thunk. And this recoil spring brings it back and lets it ring.
Well, let's try
That's
this
funny.
one, Joy to the World.
Wonderful, sure.
Bravo, that sounded great.
There's one other little thing I have to tell you when you're listening. We're always practicing. There's no way to practice this except the town hears it. So every time we're playing, that's really practice. You can't do it silently and get anything out of it. So it's a little different than other instruments. But it's a wonderful amount of fun.
It is, and I know the people driving down Broadway are probably hearing this right now and
Wondering.
thinking, what is going on? I hear bells from heaven.
Right.
We are currently now sitting in the sanctuary of this magnificent church at the Central Methodist Church, and I'm sitting with the current minister, David McBride. Hi, David.
Hi.
Welcome to the Spirit of Winona.
Thank you.
Tell me, how exactly is the Methodist Church different than other Christian churches?
Probably the distinctive feature is that the Methodist Church, Methodist movement was started by John Wesley. He was a priest in the Church of England back in the 1700s, and emphasized two things that were unique for him. He emphasized a spiritual life and a social life. The fact that you needed to combine both your inner spiritual feelings and worship of God with a social activism. And those two need to inform each other and go hand in hand.
Okay, now that you've been here for 6 or 7 months, tell me, how are you feeling about the church and what makes this church special?
I'm feeling excited about the church. I think it has a lot of potential. People are open to change, and there are a number of folks that are wanting to see some change, to see the congregation reach out more, be more involved in mission and more involved in ministry, both in the community and at large. There are about 450 members. There are a group that have been active in Habitat for Humanity, and there are several other ways that they've been involved in mission as well.
Tell me what mission means. You talk about mission. What does that mean?
It means a variety of things, but essentially it is finding ways to share the love of God in a tangible way to someone's life and trying to make a difference to them. Well, one of the things I think that has been important for this congregation has been the building and being in a downtown location so that they can find ways to serve the community. The building's been important, obviously, because of the fires. The fires that have burned down the building and taken away their place of worship, and so they've wanted to make it a very special place as a result of those fires.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're quite
Good luck
welcome.
to you.
Thank you.
Now, this church seems to go on forever. It starts here on Main Street and goes all the way to Johnson Street. I mean, it's the longest church in town, certainly. But this isn't all church, is it?
The main part we're sitting in is the sanctuary that was rebuilt after the 1961 fire. To the west of that is a narthex area. There's church offices there. The chapel is in that part of the church as well. And then we have a part that was added to the church in 1926, also a gift of the Nortons and other families in Winona, we call Guild Hall. And it was designed really for a social gathering, recreational facility. It has a full-size gymnasium, a theater area, actually a stage and theater area with a projection booth and a balcony and kitchen facilities, plus part of it was the ladies' parlor. That was built in the 1920s and reflects that kind of architecture, yet it was architecturally, I think, very similar to the one that the original church building was built in 1897.
We're currently sitting in the parlor now of the church, and we are very fortunate today to have one of the oldest members of the church here. And I understand, Lois, that you are probably one of the longest standing members of this church. Is that correct?
I feel I am. I entered in what they called the cradle roll department back in 1928. And I will say I don't quite remember entering, but I'd have a beautiful parchment certificate with the date and signed.
Now tell me something about this room. I understand there are some wonderful artifacts in this room. I mean, I look around and there are some beautiful pieces.
There are a lot of them. And I'm going to be real honest and say my favorite one in this room is our Tiffany lamp, which was given to the church by the Watkins family in 1925. And then at one time it was stolen. And with the help of the Watkins family, we recovered it. When it was given to the church, it was a $400 lamp.
Well, I think it's wonderful, Lois, that you were raised in this church and how much it has meant to you, and you're still enjoying the church.
I do. I have my one special place I sit in church. I did in the old church too.
Great.
And I can remember the fire very distinctly.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the fire?
I can still remember Central Park over here, and we had Winona statue, and everybody was standing over there, and people were crying, and we were watching, and how happy we were that they saved the bell tower. And when that afternoon with the bell tower full of icicles, and John Duell made it up, and we heard a dong of the chimes, we knew it was there.
This church has brought you a lot of pleasure, hasn't it?
It has, and it's going to continue.
Well, Elle, now let's talk about that morning, that cold, cold morning in the 1960s.
Right.
What happened to this church, this beautiful church that was built in 1897?
Well, apparently there was an electrical short in the attic. It happened in the early morning hours on a Sunday. I recall getting ready for Sunday school. In fact, I specifically recall putting my foot up on a chair, tying my shoe, when word came, I don't know if it was a phone call or over the radio, that Central Church was burning down. And instead of going to Sunday school, we went down as a family and watched, as many people in Winona did and can recall that memory in that day, watched the church just completely be destroyed by fire, with the exception of the bell tower and the Guildhall structure. It was a very sad day. Ice that was hanging because the fire department used a lot of water, obviously, to put the fire out. And coming back after the fire was put out, it just looked so sad, and feeling that, is this the end? course, it wasn't. The church leaders met. We worshiped for a time at the old YWCA. Then we worshiped at the YMCA. And then within, I think, about a 1 or 2 week period, we had the guild hall ready. The folks came in, cleaned everything up, and that's where we held our services. Regular church services, weddings, funerals, and everything that goes on, baptisms. We held services there until this building that we're in now was dedicated and is and has been used ever since.
The loss was incredible. In monetary value, it exceeded $750,000. But at 2 p.m. that very day, plans were laid down to continue services. The shell of the building sat for nearly 2 years. Rubble was cleaned up, and in the fall of 1962, construction of the new building began. The bell tower and the arches at the front of the building remained intact. Everything else between the bell tower and Guild Hall had been destroyed. On December 8, 1963, after a lengthy campaign to raise money for the rebuilding of the church, the cornerstone was laid, and 1 year later the new church was complete. The bell tower and arches were nicely incorporated into the new design of the church. The steps no longer flow from the arches on Main Street because the entrance was moved to the Broadway side of the church. Here we see the current name of the church, so named in the 1920s when the word Episcopal was dropped and it became known as the Central United Methodist Church. Al tells us about the most unique change in the church finished in 1964.
And what I think was really unique about the church is the stained glass windows that are in the sanctuary that you see today. At that time, the trend in stained glass or church windows was toward a type of faceted or slab glass. The church went to Philadelphia, and there was an artist by the name of Mrs. Odell Prather who designed the windows that we see not only in the sanctuary but also in the Norton Chapel. And using this particular faceted or slab glass approach, the windows themselves, the 9 in the sanctuary, tell the story of Christ from birth to ascension. And the glory window in front is actually, it's really called Christ, I am the vine. And the symbolism derives from that. What's interesting about faceted or slab glass is that up close it looks like a bunch of colored glass put in cement. But when you step back, every lancet, which is the name for each section of the window, tells a story in glass and has symbols of the entire life of Christ, the religious symbolism that goes along with that. You'll see flowers, you'll see figures, you'll see ships, you'll see the symbolism of the vine, the resurrection, the lamb. I mean, they're all in there. Mm-hmm. It's very, very fascinating.
Well, Al, you really brought us up to date with the history of this church and telling us about the actual building itself and about the fire. I know the fire was really a significant part of this church. And tell me about you yourself, about how you felt about being a member of this church all your life.
Well, obviously being a member is all about your faith, and it's also about family. I think for me it was a part of growing up because my parents were members here, their parents and their parents before them were, and my granddaughter is a 6th generation potential member of Central Methodist Church, so it really ties that history together.
Well, Al, I want to thank you for bringing me into this church and giving me such an interesting history about it, giving me a tour, and the bell tower has just been incredible. The story behind that is wonderful. I know everyone's really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce.
And thank you, too, for joining me today. Please join me again next week. Till then, enjoy the Spirit of Winona.